Thank you very much, Katie. I do hope that everybody in the hall can hear me clearly enough. Good. Okay. Well, I'm speaking to you from Leicester Crown Court. And as Katie's already said, I can't join you, regrettably, in Eastbourne because I'm here doing a trial. And it's a trial which is resumed on Monday of this week in consequence of the ballot which came out on Monday morning for barristers who are practicing in criminal work to go back to court. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that, but may I start by making this observation. I've been in the labor movement since I was 18 years old. And across that time, I've been in various unions, sadly not in the NAPO. NAPO has not been one of the unions that I've been a member of, but I've certainly contributed to our professional association for criminal barristers. And over the last year, having been the chair and had the privilege of leading my colleagues at the criminal bar, I've taken a lot of the responsibility for the action that we embarked upon in the face of a very difficult and intransigent government who simply weren't understanding or willing to recognize the scale of the crisis within the criminal justice system with which all of us in this conference are all too familiar. And it seems to me that what we are facing today is a crisis actually that's quite unprecedented. It's bearing down on all of us, those of you who work within the probation services and the family courts in whatever capacity will know firsthand the stress that's been associated with the accumulation of an extraordinary number of cases in the backlog, which stands around today at the figure of about 61,000 cases. And it's we, those are the professionals and the staff members who are serving the criminal justice system, who are having to deal with that problem. And it's not a problem that fell out of the sky, and nor is it a problem which has been caused by the pandemic. It's certainly been exacerbated by it, but it's not the consequence of it. And it's a point that we've been trying to make to the public because the government know the truth, but they don't want to disclose what the reality is, that in fact, this is a crisis entirely of this government's making. It's the result of negligence and a refusal to invest in our system and in the men and women who run the system adequately to ensure that it provides that service to the public. So those of you who know how badly this backlog has been growing over the last few years will be aware that by 2019, before the pandemic broke, it was already hitting nearly 40,000. By the time we got into March of 2020, when the pandemic really began to bite on our system, it had risen to about 41,000. And then in consequence of the pandemic, it leapt to 60,000. Who are the people who are having to deal with that problem? It's us. It's those of us who are at the coalface, those of us who are having to deal with people who are caught up in the system innocently. That's to say the complainants who bring those cases through the Crown Prosecution Service, and then all of us who become engaged at one stage or another. Each of us has felt the stress of having to deal with all the anxiety that victims, complainants, defendants, witnesses, court staff, judiciary, and legal professionals have had to bear over these last 2 or 3 years in particular. And we took the view, and we're very frank about this in the Criminal Bar Association, that enough was enough. We took the view that it was no good anymore simply accepting government excuses or prevarication, or allowing them to park these issues on some half promise that they would come back to them when the situation generally in the country was going to be better. The situation in this country is as a result of their policies. It is not something which happened organically or simply hit us like some sort of meteor. It is the consequence, let us be clear, of a deliberate policy of relegating our criminal justice system to being the poor cousin of our legal system in this country. It is a complete disregard for the very victims that the government says it's so concerned about. It's an abrogation of their duty to defendants who are languishing in custody. And it's a complete disinterest, of course, in myself, my colleagues, and your good selves. They simply do not care. And the consequence of them not caring is that they have reduced your staff levels to a point where so few of you are now left to service the work that is there. We have lost a quarter of our workforce over the last 5 years. Last year alone, we lost another 300 dedicated criminal practitioners who defend and prosecute. And out of the juniors for whom we've got the greatest concern, because they're the supply of new talent that we need to nurture and retain, 40% of our criminal juniors simply couldn't do the job anymore. And is it any wonder? Is it any wonder that they couldn't, when we know now, because of the publicity we pushed out there through the media, that our criminal juniors within the first 3 years of their practice earn a median income of £12,200. It's an absolute disgrace. And although we are self-employed professionals, if you were to convert that amount of money into a 40-hour week, it means that our young professionals were earning about £6.25 an hour. That's not just below minimum wage, it's illegal. It simply shouldn't be permitted. And so, conference, we took the view that once the independent review by Sir Christopher Bellamy was published, which was in November of last year, we would give the government their final opportunity to address this problem and to invest properly within the system. And if they weren't prepared to do that, then we were no longer willing to be fobbed off with excuses. And there's a lesson in all of this. No one in the public, I imagine, would ever have expected to see criminal barristers out on strike. They would never have thought to see us outside court centers on the steps, issuing media declarations, speaking to cameras, talking to radio stations, and then telling the world effectively how bad the system is and how we were unprepared any longer to go in through those court days and to do a job for a pittance. And we took that stand knowing full well that at that time we would not have coordination with all those others within the justice sector who themselves were seeking to get a fair settlement for their union members. We knew that we'd have to do this on our own, at least initially. We did so nonetheless. And there are lessons I hope that we can all share from our own experience of confronting the government and facing them down. And the first is this. Although we are an association, in effect, we were operating as a union. We are internally democratic. Our leadership is accountable. And these are absolutely fundamental if we are to build solidarity and support from our membership across the country. We ensured that we were available to our members to interrogate as to our strategy and our tactics and the approach that we were taking with the demands that we made to government. One of the consequences of the entire COVID experience, I'm sure we will all agree, is that somebody like me can beam in from Leicester to speak to you in Eastbourne. And we did exactly the same for our members across the country. And at the last meeting, the last national Zoom we had with our membership, we had over 1,000 people actually linking in to that national Zoom. And it enabled us to communicate with them and to keep them up to speed in real time. Secondly, our messaging to our membership through my own messages, which were out fortnightly, telling them what was going on with negotiations and discussions, and steeling them for a fight that they would eventually need to pitch in and deliver upon, because we recognized that if the government weren't going to move, we had no other choice but to do the one thing that those of us who are legal professionals, yourselves who work within probation and the family courts, can do, and that is to withdraw our labor. It's the only resource we have. It's the most precious resource we have. It is not us who are replete with stocks of capital and savings and properties that they can draw upon when times get hard. Over 80% of our criminal barristers went into debt or dipped into their savings when the pandemic was at its height because we weren't allowed access to the support that government was giving elsewhere. And when we think about how poor people have become in our sector, although the public had a perception of barristers being relatively wealthy people, it was only when we told them the figures about our junior barristers and when we explained to them that over the last 15 years, we had lost 28% of our real earnings in consequence of a failure to increase fees and also the impact of inflation, which is now ravaging our economy and reducing the value of anything that we might get by way of a fee increase. So we learned the lessons, the economic lessons, and they are hard lessons. And we realized, of course, that we weren't alone, that all of us who are enjoined in the justice sector, who are working together cooperatively as we have been, need to stand up together and make our voices heard. And although the criminal barristers were the first to bolt, it doesn't mean that others won't be following suit. And we know, of course, that various unions are balloting their members as to whether they are prepared to accept the miserly amounts of pay increases which this government is offering. which fall way short of inflation at around 11%, which may continue to rise. This is an insult to all of us, particularly when our working conditions have deteriorated to such an extent that we are losing people every single day. It's affecting our physical health, it's affecting our mental health, our morale, our feeling of commitment to the job that we all signed up for because we love this job, because we want to help the public in what we do, but we cannot do it indefinitely. And so it's important, I suppose, to learn from our colleagues and comrades across the country. What can we do that will improve our position? Well, if one goes to the end of the story for the criminal bar, of course, we got a settlement out of government. Many of us, of course, feel that it's not enough, but it was balloted upon and we narrowly decided to return to work with a 57% vote in favor of going back to work and suspending the strike and 43% who wanted to hold out for longer. Bear in mind, conference, that we started with 91% of the criminal bar in our last major ballot who favored going on strike, either permanently or during alternate weeks. That is an extraordinarily high level of commitment to people who knew that they would be losing money every single day because they're self-employed and they wouldn't be going to court. And it also reflects the deep commitment that these human beings have to the system that we are trying to support, that they were willing to go even deeper into debt for a cry of help to the public to say, we need to sort this mess out. And we also ensured that we drew upon the best legal advice from our colleagues across the bar. And that is why we were able to face down the Lord Chief Justice when he indicated that we might all get into trouble with our regulator for taking strike action and that we might be facing wasted costs applications from the Crown Prosecution Service. Well, we dealt with that. We dealt with it with a letter to the Times signed by 70 Silk saying that the Lord Chief Justice had overstepped the line. We dealt with it by getting advice from some of the best civil barristers in the country who told us that we had the right to strike under Article 11 of the Convention. I know that you all in conference are very familiar with the protections that we have under our convention, which are being threatened by this government. And Article 11, of course, is the right of association that protected our right to withhold our labor. And we also got advice on the abuse of data protection by the Ministry of Justice and the nonsense we were being told by them that they would not impose a fee increase on the existing 60,000+ cases in the backlog, and we'd only get those fee increases from new cases from September 30th onwards. Well, we dealt with all that. And we dealt with it in a concerted, strategic fashion, knocking down every objection they had and threatening them with legal action when it was necessary, to the point where the MOJ had to concede. And so what was the result of all of this effort? Initially, they were saying to us that we'd only get fee increases on new cases, as I said, from September the 30th, which would cost them no more than 35 million. As a consequence of this strike action, where have they found this money from? Goodness knows where, but they found it. Another 40 million pounds. 40 million pounds, which will be invested in fees for criminal barristers to try and stabilize this patient, which is on critical life support because people are leaving this profession every single day. It's not enough, but it's a big leap forward. And what does it tell us? It tells us that as union members and association members, we must appreciate and recognize the strength that we hold. We are not helpless. We have friends across the board, and we have our own determination to do something about this. And we do so by knowing that the public are coming around to realizing how bad the crisis was and how legitimate our grievances are. The media campaign that we waged turned even the center-right and the right-wing press in our favor. We started having the Times saying that 25% was a fair request in terms of a fee increase for barristers who were languishing, as they had been for years, without any sort of increase at all. And even the Daily Telegraph seemed to be becoming sympathetic to us. Well, that's a lesson for all of us, isn't it? That if you manage your media campaign well, and you get those stories out there, and you push to the front the most vulnerable of your members, and for us it was the juniors who were living on a pittance, you will find that the public eventually will begin to sympathize with your plight. And in all of that, I hope that we have inspired other unions, not just within the justice sector, but our teachers and our nurses and our doctors and our rail workers and those in the civil service to believe that if you do, in fact, follow through on a threat to strike, eventually this government will find the money. Because by golly, they found the money to remove those caps on bankers' bonuses and to reduce the tax load on the richest in society. When they need to find the money, they can. And that is why it's important for us to remember this lesson, that when you need to stand up for something worth fighting for, the people who run the system and the system itself, then you may need to make those big choices. Take a deep breath, do the ballot, and stand together in support of each other across this country against a government which is trying to eliminate us entirely from this sector so that we can't help the public the way we wish to. Thank you very much, conference.